Harmony Ridge, Texas, 1886. The spring social at Trinity Church happened every April, the same way it had happened for 11 years running. Tables lined the churchyard, covered in white cloth gone slightly gray from a decade of washing. Every family brought a dish. Every dish told you something about the family that brought it. Caleb Turner arrived late, the way he always did. He was 46 years old, and he owned more land than any three men in the county combined, 12,000 acres of grazing ground that ran clear to the Canadian River. He had buried a wife 6 years earlier and had not danced since. People in Harmony Ridge respected Caleb the way people respect weather. From a distance. With caution. Never quite close enough to touch. He came to the social because Reverend Samuel Brooks had asked him twice, and because refusing a third time would have felt like an insult to a good man. His foreman, Daniel Pierce, had teased him about it the whole ride into town. "You're going to stand in the corner again," Daniel said, grinning under his hat brim. "Eat 2 plates of cobbler, say 4 words to the Reverend, and ride home before the fiddle starts. I've watched you do it 11 springs running." "Somebody has to hold up the church wall," Caleb said. "Might as well be me. One of these years, Caleb Turner, that wall's going to hold itself up just fine without you." Caleb did not answer that. He had buried his wife, Margaret, 6 winters back, after a fever took her in 3 brutal days, and in the years since, he had built a habit of standing where the noise of other people's happiness could reach him without asking anything of him in return. It was not sadness exactly. It was closer to a kind of careful distance, the sort a man keeps from a fire he is no longer sure he is allowed to warm himself at. He took a plate. He walked the length of the table, past the ham, past the cornbread, past 3 kinds of cobbler, and he did not slow down until he reached a modest wooden bench near the church wall. The bench sat below a trellis. The trellis was covered in roses, deep red climbing roses, the kind that did not grow wild in that part of Texas, the kind that took years of patient work to establish. Caleb had walked past that trellis every spring for a decade and never once looked at it. This year he stopped walking. He set his plate down. He touched one of the blooms, careful, the way a man touches something he suspects might not be real. The petals were soft and full and smelled like something out of a memory he could not place. "Reverend," he said, and his voice carried across the churchyard the way a quiet man's voice does when he finally uses it. "Who planted these roses?" The churchyard did not go silent all at once. It went silent the way a room goes silent when a question lands somewhere nobody expected it to land. Reverend Brooks turned. Eleanor Whitmore, who ran the Women's Committee and knew the answer to nearly every question asked in Harmony Ridge, opened her mouth and then closed it again, because for the first time in a long while, she realized she did not actually know. Nobody answered right away. Not because the truth was hidden. Because the truth was sitting on a low stool at the far edge of the yard, in a faded blue dress, folding a napkin over and over into smaller and smaller squares, hoping the question would simply move past her the way most things in Harmony Ridge had learned to move past her. Her name was Evelyn Harper. She was 31 years old, and she had been quietly disappearing from Harmony Ridge for 2 years. Nobody had decided to forget Evelyn Harper. That was the strange cruelty of it. Small towns do not usually plan their unkindness. It happens in increments. A widow stops being invited because someone assumes she needs time alone. Then she stops being invited because the first year of not inviting her became a habit. Then the habit becomes the way things simply are, and nobody remembers deciding anything at all. Evelyn had come to Harmony Ridge in 1881 to marry Owen Harper, a gentleman who ran a small nursery plot on the edge of town, 11 acres where he grew vegetables for the general store and, on the side, roses, because his mother had grown roses in Georgia and he liked the way they made people stop and look at something other than their own troubles. Owen used to say a town with roses in it was a town that still believed in something. He died of a lung fever in the winter of 1884, 2 years back, and left Evelyn with 11 acres, a small unpainted house, and a debt at the feed store that she had been quietly paying down $1 at a time ever since. She had not cried where anyone could see her. That, more than the debt, more than the widowhood, was the thing Harmony Ridge had never quite forgiven. A grief that did not perform itself made people uneasy. It made them wonder if maybe she had not loved him the way a woman is supposed to love a husband, which was unfair and untrue and exactly the kind of small, careless cruelty that towns manufacture out of nothing but discomfort. Caleb did not know any of this yet. He only knew that a woman at the edge of the yard had gone very still, and that stillness, more than any answer, told him he had asked the right question of the wrong silence. He did not press the matter that evening. He was not a man who pressed. But 3 days later, riding back from the feed store, he passed the Harper nursery, and he saw her kneeling in the dirt at the edge of the road, working a spade around the roots of a rose bush no bigger than his forearm, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hands the color of the earth she was working. He slowed his horse without meaning to. "Mrs. Harper," he said. She looked up, startled, and for a moment something crossed her face that he would later understand was simple disbelief that a man like Caleb Turner knew her name. "Mr. Turner." She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Can I help you with something?" "The roses at the church. Trinity's trellis." "What about them?" "You planted them." It was not a question this time, and she did not treat it like one. She looked at the small bush in front of her instead of at him. "My husband started them. I kept them going. Nobody in town knew that. Nobody in town asked." She said it plainly, without bitterness, the way a person states a fact about weather or distance, and something in the plainness of it landed on Caleb harder than an accusation would have. "I'm asking now," he said. She studied him for a long moment, the way a person studies a stranger deciding whether kindness is a trick or a mercy. Then she went back to her spade. "There's roses along the schoolhouse fence too," she said. "And behind the mercantile. And 2 bushes by the old well nobody uses anymore. I've been putting them in for 3 years. Started before Owen passed. Kept going after. Why? Because he believed a town with flowers in it remembers how to be gentle with itself." She said it quietly, like something she had not said aloud in a long while. "I don't know if that's true. I just know I promised him I'd keep planting, and it's the one promise I've managed to keep." Caleb sat on his horse a long moment, looking at the small, tired, unpainted house behind her, and the 11 acres of vegetable rows she was clearly tending alone, and he felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for yet. Not pity. Pity would have insulted her, and some part of him understood that instantly. Something closer to recognition. 2 people who had each learned to carry a private grief in a town too busy to notice either of them carrying it. "I'd like to see the rest," he said. "The ones by the schoolhouse. If you'd show me sometime." She almost smiled. It was the first time in 2 years anyone in Harmony Ridge had asked to spend time with Evelyn Harper for no reason but her company. "Sometime," she said, and went back to her digging, and Caleb rode on toward his ranch with a question in his mind that had nothing to do with flowers at all. Later that same week, Martha Ellis walked the half-mile from her own small house to sit with Evelyn on the porch step, the way she had every Thursday evening for 2 years, rain or shine, whether Evelyn wanted company or not. "Caleb Turner rode past here twice this week," Martha said, not quite looking at her friend. "Once is a man passing through. Twice is a man finding reasons." He asked about the roses. And did the roses tell him anything else while he was asking? Evelyn laughed despite herself, a short surprised sound she had not made in longer than she could remember. "You're worse than the church committee, Martha Ellis. The church committee couldn't find their own front porch without a map. I've got better instincts than the lot of them combined, and I'm telling you, that man rode 2 miles out of his way twice in 1 week for a woman he claims he's only asking about flowers. Evelyn looked out at the rows of vegetables, the small bushes along the fence, the house Owen had built with his own 2 hands the summer before they married. She thought of him often in that particular hour of the evening, when the light went soft and gold and the whole yard seemed to hold its breath. She remembered a night 4 years earlier, Owen kneeling in this same dirt, pressing a rose cutting into the ground with more hope than skill. "Half these won't take root," she had told him. "Half is enough," he'd said, grinning up at her, dirt on his cheek. "A town only needs a little proof that something gentle can still grow in it. People forget that faster than they forget anything else. And if I'm the one who has to keep proving it, after you're gone." He had gone quiet at that, because even then, some small honest part of him must have known his lungs were not built for a long life. "Then you keep proving it," he'd said finally, "one bush at a time, and you let the roses do the arguing you're too tired to do yourself." She had kept that promise for 3 years now, mostly to a town that had never once thanked her for it, and some nights that had felt like enough, and other nights it had felt like carrying water in a bucket with no bottom. "He's a good man," Martha said now, breaking the quiet. "Owen would have liked him. Wouldn't hold it against you to notice that." Evelyn said nothing to that, but she did not argue either, which from a woman as careful with her words as Evelyn Harper, was its own kind of admission. Amos Walker had lived on the edge of Harmony Ridge longer than the town had owned its name. He had fought at Vicksburg, lost 2 fingers on his left hand to frostbite the winter after, and settled into a life of tending the church grounds and remembering things other people had let themselves forget. He was 71 years old and sharper than most men half his age. Caleb found him behind the church, trimming the trellis with the slow, careful attention people give to work they consider a form of prayer. "You knew," Caleb said. "About Evelyn Harper and the roses." Amos did not look up from his trimming. "Knew since the first bush went in behind the mercantile." "Nobody asked me either. People don't ask the man raking leaves. They just assume the leaves rake themselves. Why didn't you say something? Would it have mattered, 3 years ago?" Town wasn't ready to hear it 3 years ago. Town was still deciding Evelyn Harper's grief wasn't loud enough to count as real grief. Amos finally turned, and his eyes, pale with age, held no accusation, only a tired honesty. "Owen Harper was the finest man I knew in this town, and I watched 30 years of war before I came here. He believed something worth believing. His wife's been keeping his belief alive with her own 2 hands for 3 years running, alone, unpaid, unthanked, while half this town walked past those roses and never once wondered where they came from. That's not a secret, son. That's just a truth nobody bothered to go looking for." Caleb absorbed that the way a man absorbs a truth he suspects will cost him something to act on. "I mean to change that," he said. "Then you'd best move quick," Amos said, turning back to his trimming. "Because Silas Mercer's been asking around about the deed on the Harper land, and Silas Mercer doesn't ask about land he doesn't intend to take." Silas Mercer had come to Harmony Ridge 18 months earlier with a good suit, a smooth voice, and a habit of learning everything about everyone before they had learned anything about him. He told people he was in land speculation, which was true, and he told people he had the town's best interests at heart, which was not. He had heard, through channels he kept carefully private, that the Texas and Panhandle rail line was surveying a route that would run directly through the eastern edge of Harmony Ridge, and that the Harper Nursery, 11 quiet acres nobody in town valued at more than pocket change, sat squarely in the path of what would soon be the most valuable ground in the county. He had already made 2 offers to Evelyn Harper. She had refused both, quietly, the way she refused most things that involved raising her voice. "You understand," he told her on his 3rd visit, standing in her dirt yard in a suit that cost more than her entire year's harvest, that a woman alone can't hold on to land forever. Debts have a way of finding widows first. The debt is $31, Mr. Mercer, and it will be paid by harvest. Debts have a way of growing when a man wants them to. It was not quite a threat. It was close enough to one that Evelyn understood him perfectly, and closed her door, and did not sleep well that night, and told no one, because telling people had stopped being something she believed would help. Silas was patient. He had learned that patience, applied to the right pressure point, worked better than force ever did. He went to the feed store the next morning and quietly bought up the note on Evelyn's debt from the owner, a nervous, round-shouldered man named Harlan Voss who kept a ledger book he understood considerably better than he understood the men who occasionally paid him to overlook its finer print. $31, Harlan said, counting it twice, as if the number might change on a third look. Can't see why a man in your line of business wants a debt this small, Mr. Mercer. Small debts are easier to be generous about, Harlan. It costs a man very little to be kind over $31. Silas smiled the way he always smiled, pleasant and unhurried. You'll want to sign here. And here. Harlan signed both, and did not read the acceleration clause buried in the second paragraph, because Harlan Voss had never in his life expected a stranger's kindness to come with fine print attached, which was precisely the assumption Silas Mercer had built an entire career on. Silas now owned Evelyn Harper's $31, and the terms attached to it, and the terms allowed the note to be called due in full with 14 days' notice, a fact Harlan would not fully understand until a judge explained it to him under oath. Caleb did not learn about the debt until he brought Daniel Pierce, his ranch foreman, into the matter. Man like Mercer doesn't buy up $31 of debt for the interest, Daniel said, leaning against the corral fence, arms crossed. He's clearing a path to something. You want my advice, you find out what that something is before he finishes clearing it. Caleb rode into town that same afternoon and found Noah Carter at the blacksmith's forge, hammering a wagon axle into shape. Rail survey, Noah said, without looking up from his anvil. Heard it from a man passing through last week. Said the panhandle lines looking at a route east of town. Didn't think much of it till now. Caleb thought of 11 quiet acres of vegetable rows and rose bushes, and understood, all at once, exactly what Silas Mercer had been buying. That evening he went to Reverend Brooks, and to Lydia Bennett, the schoolteacher who had been one of the only people in town still kind to Evelyn on the rare occasions their paths crossed, and to Eleanor Whitmore, whose discomfort at the spring social had been quietly working on her conscience for a week. I owe her an apology, Eleanor admitted, twisting her handkerchief the way Evelyn had twisted her napkin. I've walked past those roses for 3 years thinking some committee must be tending them. Never once thought to ask which hands were doing the work. Apologies are good, Caleb said. But she needs more than an apology in 14 days. She needs this town to remember it owes her something. Lydia nodded slowly. Then we'd best remind it. Silas Mercer called the note on a Tuesday morning, standing on Evelyn's porch with a folded paper and an expression arranged to look regretful. 14 days, Mrs. Harper. That's what the terms allow, and I mean to collect what's owed me, in coin or in acreage. I don't have $31 in 14 days, Mr. Mercer, and you know it. Then perhaps we discuss the acreage instead. It was, at that moment, that Caleb Turner rode up the lane, dismounted, and stood beside Evelyn on her own porch without being asked, which was its own kind of answer. The debt will be paid, Mercer. In full. Today, if you'd like it. Silas's smooth composure slipped for exactly 1 second before he recovered it. That's a generous offer for another man's debt, Turner. It's not generosity. It's arithmetic. $31 is nothing to me and everything to you, which tells me the debt was never the point. Caleb held his gaze steady. The point is the railway survey you've been keeping quiet about. I'd be careful how loud you make that quiet, Mercer. Judge Foster doesn't take kindly to a man who buys up a widow's debt under false pretenses to force a land sale ahead of a rail announcement. That's fraud in most counties I've ridden through. For the first time since arriving in Harmony Ridge, Silas Mercer had nothing smooth to say. He left the debt paper on the porch rail and rode back to town with the particular quiet of a man recalculating every plan he had made. Judge Benjamin Foster held court in the back room of the Harmony Ridge Mercantile twice a month, and word of Silas Mercer's dealings had reached him within 2 days, carried by Amos Walker, who had quietly written down every date and detail he'd observed over 18 months of raking leaves and noticing things. The hearing was short. Harlan Voss, sweating through his collar, admitted he had sold the note without reading the acceleration clause Silas had drafted into it. Noah Carter testified to the rail survey rumor. Reverend Brooks testified to Silas's visits and his tone. Martha Ellis, Evelyn's oldest and truest friend in town, stood and said plainly that she had watched a good woman be quietly starved of community for 2 years and would not stand by and watch her be robbed of land on top of it. Judge Foster ruled the note void for fraudulent terms, fined Silas Mercer the full amount of the debt plus court costs, and suggested, in the dry tone judges use when they mean something far stronger than the words themselves, that Harmony Ridge was not a county where Silas Mercer would find his business welcome going forward. Silas left within the month. Nobody in Harmony Ridge missed him. The following spring, the churchyard trellis bloomed heavier than it had in years, because half the women who had ignored Evelyn Harper for 2 seasons had spent the winter learning to garden alongside her, Eleanor Whitmore included, her handkerchief long since put away in favor of a pair of worn gardening gloves. Caleb had not stopped visiting the 11 acres since the day of the hearing. He came at first to check on the roses, and then to check on Evelyn, and then, by early summer, simply because the 11 acres had become the place he thought of first when he woke and last before he slept. "You don't have to keep riding out here," Evelyn told him one evening, sitting beside him on the porch step, the sky gone the color of the roses behind them. "I know I don't have to." "Then why do you?" He thought of the harvest dance the town had held 2 weeks earlier, the first dance he had attended in 6 years, and how he had crossed the entire barn floor in front of everyone, past Eleanor Whitmore's raised eyebrows and Noah Carter's grin, to ask Evelyn Harper for the first waltz instead of standing against the wall the way Daniel always teased him about. He remembered her hand fitting into his like it had been shaped for exactly that purpose, and the particular hush that fell over Harmony Ridge when the whole town realized, all at once, that the lonely rancher and the forgotten widow had quietly stopped being either of those things. "Because I danced with you 2 weeks ago," he said now, "and for the first time in 6 years I wasn't counting the minutes until I could leave a room. Because for 6 years I've owned 12,000 acres and felt like a man with no ground under him at all. And I've spent one spring on 11 acres that don't belong to me and finally remembered what it feels like to want to come home." She did not answer with words. She reached over and took his hand, the same hand that had touched a rose bloom without knowing why, months earlier, and held it, and the two of them sat together in the kind of quiet that asks nothing and takes nothing and simply is. They married the following autumn, at Trinity Church, beneath a trellis heavier with roses than anyone in Harmony Ridge could remember it being. Evelyn kept the 11 acres and the roses along the schoolhouse fence and behind the mercantile and by the old well nobody used anymore, and she added a new bed of climbing roses along the fence line of Caleb's ranch house, because a promise kept for one man, she said, could still grow enough to be kept for another. Eleanor Whitmore now runs the garden committee Evelyn once tended alone, and makes certain, every spring, that whoever plants the flowers gets asked their name before the second season passes. Amos Walker still trims the church trellis, and still notices things nobody else bothers to look for, and he says, when anyone asks, that the whole business taught him something he already half knew: a town is only as kind as the attention it's willing to pay to the people it has stopped looking at. Harmony Ridge learned that year that grief wearing a quiet face is still grief, that kindness done without an audience is still kindness, and that the people doing the most good in a town are often the ones the town has stopped noticing at all. Silence is not the same thing as contentment, and a person can be surrounded by neighbors and still be left to carry a whole harvest alone, simply because nobody thought to ask a single question. It is a lesson worth keeping, the same way a good rose is worth the years it takes to grow one. Owen Harper believed a town with flowers in it remembers how to be gentle with itself. Harmony Ridge finally proved him right, 3 years after he was no longer there to see it, because his wife had never once stopped tending the proof. If you want to see how it unfolds when a town finally learns to look twice, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I would love to say hello, and to know just how far this story has traveled to reach you.